Chapter 14. I have done what I could. The wonderful news about Pasteur's success against rabies spread quickly. Only a month later, another desperate victim came to his door. J.B. Jupil, a 14-year-old shepherd boy, experienced a mad dog attack while tending his flock. He and 5 younger boys watched over their sheep. A large mad dog passed along the road. The dog saw the boys in the meadow and dashed toward them. Foam sprayed from its jaws. J.B. Jupil bravely put himself between the charging dog and the younger shepherds. He stood his ground, armed only with a whip. As the mad dog jumped toward him, the boy grabbed the ferocious dog and forced it to the ground. He called to his younger brother, who managed to wrap the dog's jaws with the whip. Then J.B. Jupil took off his wooden shoe and beat the struggling dog senseless. Finally, he and his little brother pulled the animal to a stream. They held it underwater until it drowned. J.B. Jupil had saved the other boys, but during the struggle, he received several deep gashes from the jaws of the mad dog. 2 veterinarians examined the body of the dog. "We have not the slightest doubt that the dog was rabid," they said. The mayor of the boys' village wrote to Louis Pasteur, "This lad will die a victim of his own courage unless he receives your new treatment," the mayor said. 6 days had passed since the boys' fight with the mad dog. In Joseph Meister's case, only 2.5 days had passed. However, Louis decided to go ahead with the treatment anyway. He asked the mayor to send J.B. Jupil to Paris. "I shall keep him near me in a room of my laboratory," Louis said. The treatment proved entirely successful. Of all his successes, Louis Pasteur found this one the most satisfying. It was followed by a bitter defeat. On November 9th, the parents of Louis Pasteur brought their daughter for treatment. She was 10 years old. The girl had been bitten on the head by a rabid mountain dog. "When did she receive her injuries?" Louis Pasteur asked. The father said, 37 days ago. Louis's heart fell. "The disease should make its appearance any day now," Louis said. "If my method fails, and if she should die, then it will frighten those who have put their trust in the vaccine. It might discourage others from seeking protection." The father and mother of the little girl did not speak. Their silent pleading prevented Louis from turning them away. His compassion for the girl overcame his resistance. After she received her shots, Louis sent Louise Pasteur home. She went back to school. In a few days, however, the girl complained that she could not breathe easily. Fits of convulsions shook her body. She could not swallow her food. Louis rushed to be at her side. He held her hand as she lay in bed upstairs in her parents' home. He could do nothing else for her now. His heart filled with sorrow as she begged him to stay with her. A spasm shook her body. He tried to comfort her. Finally, he had to abandon all hope. She died. As he came down the staircase, he burst into tears. He told her parents, "I did so want to save your little one." Louis Pasteur was the first patient that he lost. Critics made much of this heartbreaking failure. The father of the girl, however, found Louis blameless. He came to the aid of the man who dared to save his daughter. The father of Louise said, "Of all the great men whom I have known, Louis Pasteur is the greatest. I have never met one who would have done what he did. He sacrificed long years of toil as a scientist and jeopardized a reputation for the sake of my little daughter." For days after Louis Pasteur died, Louis received a telegram from New York. The Herald newspaper informed him that 4 young children of American working families were on their way to Paris. A mad dog had bitten them. The newspaper raised money from its readers to pay the children's passage to Paris. Louis Pasteur treated the 4 frightened little boys. After the first inoculation, one of the boys was astonished that so much fuss had been made over a simple pin prick. He burst out, "Is this all we have come such a journey for?" On March 1st, 1886, Louis presented to the Academy of Science his record of those whom he had treated with rabies vaccination. Out of 350 patients, only one had died. Louis Pasteur. When this news became public, desperate victims of mad dog attacks poured into Paris to seek help. From Russia came 19 victims of a rabid wolf. They couldn't speak any French. They found their way to the laboratory by merely saying one word, Pasteur. He directed his greatest energies toward the children. Louis said, "When I see a child, he inspires me with two feelings, tenderness for what he is now, respect for what he may become." He loved the little children. He always kept treats on hand to give to them after their shots. After they left the laboratory, he sent them letters. He urged them to write to him. "Let me hear from you," Louis would tell them. "If you don't know how to read and write, you should make every effort to learn. If you need money for your education, let me know. If you cannot write to me, have my questions answered by your mayor, your teacher, or your minister." Since the early days of his scientific career, Louis Pasteur had dreamed of saving mankind from infectious diseases. Now, with the rabies vaccine, he had achieved his goal. "You have succeeded too well," his assistant said. "The number of patients is overwhelming us. More patients come to your door than we can treat at the laboratory." "Rent more space," Louis told them. His assistants found a few buildings down the street for his use. Soon, the people seeking rabies treatment overran those buildings, too. The citizens of France began a collection to build Louis a new research laboratory. People in other countries would not let France be the only country to honor Louis Pasteur. Donations of money came from America, the Tsar of Russia, the Emperor of Brazil, the Sultan of Turkey, and many other countries. The poor and the rich sent money for the building. They decided to call it the Pasteur Institute. As construction started on the new building, Louis Pasteur was 65 years old. He tried to slow down. He found it difficult to do so because he had driven himself for too long. He'd become frail and ill. He looked it and felt it. Dr. Grandshare examined Louis Pasteur. He found symptoms of heart trouble. The doctor urged Louis to interrupt his work in Paris. "You must take a rest in the country," Dr. Grandshare said. "You deserve it, and rest is absolutely necessary to you. You have overtaxed yourself beyond all reason, and you must make up for it." Louis wisely took his doctor's advice. He traveled to the south of France. There he spent the winter at the Villa Bischofsheim. By spring, his health improved enough for him to return to Paris. Louis came back to work. On October 23rd, 1888, Louis spent the early part of the morning writing a letter. As he finished the letter, he suffered a light stroke. He didn't know anything had happened until he turned to speak to his wife. Horrified, he realized he could not speak. His tongue was paralyzed. He had a lunch appointment with his daughter. Rather than frighten her, he kept the appointment. He spent the afternoon in her home, quietly sitting in an easy chair. Later that evening, his speech returned. 2 days later, he returned to work. Except for his family, no one knew of the attack. However, only 1 week later, another stroke permanently affected his speech. The seizure reduced his powerful speaking voice to a slurred, hoarse whisper. The medical problems weakened his body, but his spirits rose as he followed the progress on the construction of the Pasteur Institute. 2.5 million francs had gone into building and furnishing the institute. The building of brick finished with stone stood behind an iron fence and hedge. The institute was the best-equipped medical research center in the world. It contained a medical library, laboratories, and classrooms. In addition to research and rabies treatment, the institute would be used to train young scientists to carry on Louis Pasteur's work. Pierre Duclos, who had been teaching at the Sorbonne, transferred his class on biological chemistry to the Pasteur Institute. On November 14, 1888, the institute officially opened. Politicians, scientists, friends, family, co-workers, and students gathered in the large library of the new building. Great men of science, education, and the government spoke about the important work that would be done at the Pasteur Institute. Finally, the time came for Louis Pasteur to speak. Even if the stroke had not affected his speech, he would nevertheless have been unable to speak. The event choked him with emotion. Louis had written out his speech. He gave it to his son, Jean-Baptiste, to read. In the speech, Louis said, "I should say that two contrary laws seem to be wrestling with each other nowadays. One is a law of blood and death, ever imagining new means of destruction and forcing nations to be constantly ready for the battlefield. The other is a law of peace, work, and health, ever developing new means of delivering man from the scourges which beset him. The one seeks violent conquests, the other relief for humanity. The latter places one human life above any victory. The former would sacrifice hundreds and thousands of lives to the ambition of one. Which of those two laws will ultimately prevail? God alone knows. We may assert that French science will have tried, by obeying the law of humanity, to extend the frontiers of life. The next day, Louis walked the halls of the Institute. Before him, he saw the physical equipment that he'd lacked as a young experimenter. Although his mind remained as sharp as ever, his body had no strength to continue research on a day-to-day basis. The number one research scientist at the Pasteur Institute was not Louis Pasteur. That honor belonged to Émile Roux. Émile Roux turned one corner of the laboratory into a miniature museum of Pasteur's most important discoveries. As Louis paused at the research door, he heard Émile speaking to the students. "Here are the little flasks Monsieur Pasteur used in his spontaneous generation experiments," Émile told the students. "Here are the test tubes he used for his studies on wine. The other flasks contain cultures with bacteria growing in them." After the students left, Louis Pasteur limped into the laboratory. Fondly, he traced his fingertips lightly over the items that had been so important to his researches. Émile also had on hand a large variety of microbes preserved on slides. They could be viewed through the microscope. Émile Roux had been searching for the cause of diphtheria, a killer of children. "Here, look at this," Émile said. He stepped aside to let Louis look into the microscope. "What you see is a sinister little microbe, the one responsible for diphtheria. It has only recently been identified. The germs of other diseases still remain a mystery. There is still so much to do," Louis told Émile. Louis moved from his quarters at the École Normale. An apartment had been prepared for him and Marie Pasteur at the Pasteur Institute. Louis took a great interest in the work going on at the Pasteur Institute. In a whisper, which was all the voice he had now, he talked with the doctors, research assistants, and students. He answered their questions and willingly gave them the benefit of his years of experience. Louis chose to live a modest life. During the summer months, when the weather was pleasant, he spent the days in a little tent in the garden of the Institute. In the afternoon, he sat in a chair under the chestnut trees. He had a high forehead and a face that appeared to be carved from a block of granite. As a younger man, his appearance caused people to think he would be difficult to approach. The strokes had softened his features. Now the gray-green eyes carried a deep and kind look which welcomed visitors. He would talk about any subject except his own health. People who spoke with him came away with their lives brightened. Even so, Émile Roux realized that those who only met him briefly never fully understood his greatness. Émile Roux said, "One has to live in close association with him to know all the goodness of his heart." In addition to seeing visitors from all over the world, Louis Pasteur also enjoyed watching his grandchildren play. He saw them daily. He found strength in his family and in his Christian religion. He had absolute faith in God. He believed that the good in the world would continue in eternity. He also entertained a special visitor. Charles Chapter, his boyhood friend, often came to sit with him in the tent in the garden. They remembered and talked about their time together as students in Arbois in Paris. When they completed their education, they took separate paths. However, they kept in touch by exchanging letters. For 50 years, they had been fast friends. Their lives had come full circle. As students, they started out spending hours together talking about their plans for the future. Now in the twilight years, they spent hours together recalling the exciting events in their past. On December 27th, 1892, Louis Pasteur celebrated his 70th birthday. Professors, physicians, surgeons, statesmen, and students from France and representatives of many foreign countries gathered to honor Louis on this special occasion. They met in the Great Hall of the Sorbonne. A wave of excitement passed through the crowd as three of Pasteur's best-known pupils entered: Pierre Duclos, Émile Roux, and Charles Chamberlain. Louis Pasteur would soon enter the hall. The band began playing a triumphal march. Slowly, Louis Pasteur entered, leaning on the arm of Francis Carnot, the President of France. Louis Pasteur limped into the hall amid thunderous applause. Dr. Joseph Lister, the great surgeon who first put Pasteur's germ theory of disease into practice, attended the celebration. He represented the Royal Society of England. Joseph Lister stood, walked forward, and shook Pasteur's hand. The two great doctors embraced one another. Dr. Lister said, "You have raised the veil that for centuries kept the cause of infectious diseases secret." Louis Pasteur took particular pleasure in seeing so many students present. The president of one of the study associations told him, "You have given a beautiful example to students." Jean-Baptiste, his son, read his speech for him. "I believe," Louis said through his son, "that science and peace will triumph over ignorance and war, that nations will unite, not to destroy, but to build. The future will belong to those who do the most for suffering humanity." And you who are still young, you students, I say to each of you, do not let yourself be tainted by that spirit of disbelief which likes to belittle everything. Say to yourself, first of all, what have I done to educate myself? Then, as you advance further, ask yourself, what have I done for my country? Until at last the time may come when you will have the very great happiness of knowing that you have done something for the progress and good of mankind. But whatever happens, whether your work succeeds or fails in the test of life, the most important thing of all, as one approaches the end, is to be able to say, "I have done what I could." This speech at his birthday celebration became Louis Pasteur's farewell address. It was his last public act. He withdrew from active research. The time passed pleasantly. In good weather, he sat in the sunlight listening to his wife read aloud biographies of famous people. In the fall, when the sunlight faded and leaves began to fall, he moved back inside. As his body grew weaker, he received spiritual strength from his religion, which he had always kept close to him. Family and friends surrounded him, showering him with peace and love. Day by day, Louis grew weaker. He spent more time in bed. By September 27th, 1895, he was almost entirely paralyzed. He could not even sip from a glass of milk. Marie stayed by his bedside. He held one of her hands. In the other hand, he held a crucifix, an image of the dying Christ on the cross. On September 28th, 1895, the end came quietly. Faintly, it was as if he heard a voice speaking to him. "Louis," the voice seemed to say, "it is time to come home. You have done all that you can do." Chapter 15. Louis Pasteur in today's world. Louis Pasteur died on September 28th, 1895. He was 3 months short of his 73rd birthday. By the time of his death, most people considered him to be the greatest doctor who had ever lived. He never attended medical school nor earned a medical degree. Yet, He did more to prolong life and overcome disease and relieve suffering than any physician. France gave Louis Pasteur a hero's funeral. They laid his body to rest in a marble crypt in the Pasteur Institute. Inscribed on the walls are a list of his discoveries, from his crystal studies to his triumph over rabies. Each of Louis Pasteur's studies seemed to lead naturally to the next one. He even remarked upon the chain of logic that carried him from organic crystals to fermentation, spontaneous generation, pasteurization, the germ theory of disease, and finally contagious diseases. Few other people have to their credit so many important advances in science. His work has stood the test of time. His findings are as important today as they were 100 years ago. What can explain his success? Louis showed no particular promise as a child. Luckily, the school at Arbois didn't give intelligence tests as some schools do today. Because he worked so slowly, Louis would have made a poor showing. The results of such a test, improperly interpreted, would have forever limited him to being a tanner's son. However, the tanner's son overcame his own limitations through hard work. As Louis said, "In everything, I believe the secret of success is prolonged efforts." As an example of his persistence, consider his work on a single subject, the question of spontaneous generation. For 5 years, Louis devoted his energies to how microscopic life arose. He proved that even the smallest germs must reproduce from germs like themselves. Tiny microorganisms do not arise by spontaneous generation. The bottles with the S-necks showed that bacteria came from bacteria. Some of his S-neck flasks are still sitting on a shelf at the Pasteur Institute. They are still as free of bacteria as when Louis Pasteur first prepared them more than 100 years ago. So far as any law of biology can be firmly proved, it is the law that life must arise from life. This conclusion directly contradicted the theory of evolution. Instead, it supported the biblical account of creation. Louis questioned the theory of evolution because Darwin did not base his ideas on experimental proof. Charles Darwin's writings owed too much to imagination and too little to hard scientific facts. Louis Pasteur understood the importance of imagination to spark a line of research. For example, imagination helped him realize that the chickens had been vaccinated by weak chicken collar culture. He followed that burst of insight with months of gathering solid evidence to support his idea. If the facts contradicted the theory, then he would eliminate the theory from his mind. The greatest danger to the mind is to believe in something because one wishes to do so, Louis Pasteur told his students. Imagination should give wings to our thoughts, but we always need decisive experimental proof. When we draw conclusions and interpret observations, imagination must be checked against factual results. Much of Louis Pasteur's scientific triumphs can be traced to his decision to base his work upon experimental facts. His discoveries came after long years of exhaustive tests. Only then would he put them into practice. Sometimes he overcame objections of the scientists of his day by enlisting public support. Despite the growing fame, Louis Pasteur never translated that fame into financial wealth. The process of pasteurization, which he perfected, could have made him a wealthy man. However, he refused this. Louis didn't let money direct his life. For instance, consider how he put loyalty to his country above monetary gain. Only 2 years after Louis's stroke, war broke out between France and Germany. Louis's left arm was paralyzed. His left leg was so stiff he could hardly walk without help. Louis limped down to the induction hall to enlist in the Home Guard. The French officials very wisely sent him back to the laboratory. France lost the war. The country suffered through a terrible time of recovery. The French government could not fully support Louis Pasteur's researches. The Italian government tried to lure Louis Pasteur from France. They offered him an attractive position at the University of Pisa. Louis refused the offer. I should feel like a deserter if I sought, away from my country in distress, a material situation better than that which it can offer me. Besides his humble nature, another important aspect of Louis Pasteur's life was his loyalty to his family and friends. A friend of Louis Pasteur's was a friend for life. Both his son-in-law and grandson have written books about him. They remember him with warmest affection. Louis reserved his greatest affection for his wife. Pasteur's last will was found after his death. He wrote it in his own hand. It could not have been more direct. "This is my testament," Louis wrote. "I leave to my wife everything that the law permits me to leave to her. May my children never stray from the path of duty and always bestow upon their mother the love that she deserves." These examples are some of the reasons for Louis Pasteur's success. But the greatest reason is his steadfast efforts to live according to the teachings of Jesus. René Valery Radot was Louis Pasteur's son-in-law. He said that absolute faith in God and in eternity were feelings which filled Louis Pasteur's whole life. The virtues of the gospel were very present to him. He came to his Christian faith simply and naturally for spiritual help in the last stages of his life. Louis Pasteur believed in prayer. He believed in the resurrection. He believed in the Bible. He held the truths of the gospel as his goal. He urged others to do the same. He put the truths of the New Testament ahead of personal feelings. He did not let false religion blind him to his duty to help those in distress. He said, "One does not ask of one who suffers, 'What is your country and what is your religion?' One merely says, 'You suffer, this is enough for me. You belong to me, and I shall help you.'" Louis gained the respect of the people of France and the world. During his lifetime, people honored Louis Pasteur as one of the greatest scientists in history. Since then, his fame has continued to grow. A few years after Louis Pasteur died, Stephen Paget, an English surgeon, studied Pasteur's life. Stephen Paget said, "Here was a life within the limits of humanity, well nigh perfect. He worked incessantly. He went through poverty, bereavement, ill health, and opposition. He lived to see his doctrines current over all the world." Yet, Stephen Paget added, "Here was a man whose spiritual life was no less admirable than his scientific life.